I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply closed my laptop while the man who barely understood the system I built tried to humiliate me on a live investor call. People think the explosion happens in the moment, but the truth is quieter. It happens earlier, when you've already prepared for the day someone mistakes your silence for weakness. I wasn't shocked, I wasn't shaken, I was waiting, and he had no idea what I still controlled behind the scenes. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and tell me in the comments what you'd have done. I didn't come back because I missed them. I came back because the company was already burning, and they knew I was the only one who could keep the flames from hitting the funding room. 9 months earlier, I walked out of that building with my badge on the table and a pit in my stomach, certain I'd never let them pull me into their chaos again. But chaos has a funny way of circling back when people cut corners, ignore warnings, and pretend luck is the same thing as competence. Their back end had collapsed twice, a major client threatened to walk, and the compliance team couldn't explain why half the integration logs were failing. They didn't tell the board the truth. They didn't have to. The numbers told it for them. So one night, while I was heating leftover pasta in my loft overlooking the river, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't save. I didn't need to. The tremble in the CEO's voice was unmistakable. Jonas tried to sound calm, but panic has its own frequency. He said they were going through a strategic realignment. That was his polite way of admitting the house of cards had finally tilted. I didn't say yes. I made him read the continuity clause from my old contract, the one they forgot existed because they assumed I'd never matter again. Clause 4.7. The founding infrastructure architect may be reinstated as a critical systems consultant during operational restructuring. He choked halfway through, and I let him sit in the silence. He needed to remember who wrote those words. When I finally stepped back into the office, the energy was familiar but colder. Same fluorescent hum, same forced cheerfulness, but underneath it was an anxiety they were too proud to name. They didn't greet me with smiles. They greeted me with problems. Broken pipelines, corrupted projections, partner integrations half failing for reasons no one could trace. They had been patching symptoms and ignoring causes. They always did. I didn't give them speeches or slide decks. I just did the work. Cleaned the system architecture, rebuilt their risk layers, untangled the compliance structures they'd slapped together for show. They didn't thank me. They didn't need to. I wasn't there for gratitude. I was there because I understood something they didn't. Power isn't loud. It isn't public. It's the unseen infrastructure everything else relies on. And I owned the map. Still, from the first week, I could feel the shift. That uneasy tension in the hallway. The glances that lasted half a second too long. They weren't comfortable with how much I understood, how easily I saw every weak joint in their process. They didn't like that I could rebuild their platform faster than they could explain what went wrong. And as soon as the system stabilized, I saw it. The same pattern that pushed me out before. The subtle exclusion, quiet distancing, meetings that evaporated from my calendar, threads I wasn't tagged in anymore. It didn't matter. I kept notes, every conversation, every request, every tiny manipulation. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd learned the real rule of corporate survival. You don't defend yourself in the moment. You prepare for the moment someone tries to erase you. And even then, they still had no idea what leverage I held in my pocket. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It never is. Corporate betrayal doesn't explode. It seeps. One morning, I opened my calendar and noticed the sprint planning invite had disappeared. Not declined, not canceled. Just gone like someone quietly dragged it into the trash and hoped I wouldn't notice. I refreshed twice, then checked my inbox. Nothing. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I felt that familiar sting, the one that comes from being useful but not welcome. Still, I let it go. You learn to pick your battles when your value makes certain people nervous. 2 days later, my name vanished from the distribution list for the Integration Oversight channel. That one made me pause. I was the one who had rebuilt half the infrastructure that channel discussed. If there was any room I needed to be in, it was that one. I tagged the project manager, asking why the change had been made. She replied with a single line. Thought leadership asked for a tighter group. Thought leadership. That was Jonas's new favorite buzzword for people who couldn't read a technical diagram but loved to narrate progress on investor calls. I screenshotted it and saved it to my private folder. I didn't respond. The next blow came when I opened the due diligence packet for our Series C review. My compliance reports were there, line for line, graph for graph, my work, my structure, my language, but my name had been replaced with a generic title, Internal Compliance Team. Not even a placeholder like engineer, just a vague, dry label incapable of defending itself. It felt like being erased by a paper cut. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I was shocked, but because it hit me just how calculated this quiet removal was, and how familiar. I'd lived this before. Women like me, especially past 40, aren't considered part of the company's future vision. We're the scaffolding they tear down once the building looks stable enough to photograph. But here's what they always forget. The scaffolding remembers where. Every bolt is buried. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed. I just took notes, observed, watched how they spoke to me with less eye contact, watched how Jonas avoided including me in strategy emails, but still assigned me the cleanup work after each failed demo. Watched how certain managers parroted lines that didn't sound like theirs. Polished, dismissive, a little too eager to remind me to focus on execution, not narrative. Then came the final confirmation that the erasure wasn't an accident. My segment in the pitch deck had been rewritten without my knowledge. The original 15 minutes I'd prepared, clear, simple explanations of risk flow, system stability, and our new licensing structure, had been replaced with 5 slides of empty metaphors. Rockets, mountains, glowing arrows pointing upward. Abstract nonsense with no substance. And right there on the metadata, edited by Victor Lang, of course it was him. The new VP who treated the office like a stage and every meeting like a spotlight. The kind of man who believed confidence outranked competence, who shook my hand like he was afraid technical knowledge might rub off on him. He was careful at first, complimenting my thorough groundwork, which is corporate code for I'm about to sideline you. And then he did, strategically, surgically. He wanted the narrative all to himself. Men like Victor don't fight you with claws. They fight you with silence. They squeeze you out of the spaces where visibility happens while keeping you in the shadows where the work still needs to be done. But they always make one mistake. They assume the person they're erasing isn't paying attention. I was. Every missing invite, every scrubbed document credit, every time he talked over me in meetings and Jonas nodded along like a guilty lamp. I collected it all quietly, not as ammunition, but as confirmation for a truth I was already preparing for. They thought I was fading, but I was documenting. They thought I was shrinking, but I was watching the ground shift under their feet. And they had no idea I already controlled the one system they couldn't afford to lose. Victor Lang introduced himself like a man arriving to accept an award. He walked into the conference room with that swagger you only see in people who think they've already won before the game starts. No notebook, no laptop, just a sleek pen he twirled like it was an accessory to his personality. I remember thinking he looked more like someone auditioning for the role of visionary leader than someone hired to fix a real product. Jonas, standing behind him, wore the strained smile of a man who knew he'd made a reckless bet but didn't want anyone to see the crack forming in his confidence. "Rachel," Victor said, extending his hand with the grip of someone who liked to assert dominance in small, controlled doses. "I've heard something about your work here." Something, as if my fingerprints weren't embedded in every layer of the system he was now supposedly responsible for elevating. But I wasn't surprised. Men like him don't waste time on details until the details bite them. I gave him a polite nod and waited. He didn't sit down. He positioned himself at the head of the table like he was claiming territory. "We're moving toward a more polished narrative," he said, pacing slightly. "We need to make sure all communication is aligned for Series C. Investors want clarity, not complexity. Keep it high level. No need to drown them in technicals." I let him talk. He mistook my silence for agreement. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was granting me a secret. "This is about selling vision, not architecture." That was the moment I recognized exactly what he was. A storyteller who had never built anything, and a strategist who had never carried the consequences of being wrong. Jonas nodded beside him, offering the kind of encouragement men give each other when they want to look united, even if one of them is defending a sinking ship. Victor scheduled a sync for the next morning, but when I joined the call, it was clear it wasn't a sync. It was a performance review disguised as a conversation. "Rachel," he started with artificial warmth, "I want to help you reposition your contributions so they align with our new direction. The way you explain things, it can be a little too granular. Investors don't want to feel like they're in a workshop." I stared at him, expression steady, heartbeat flat. "And who's overseeing the risk declarations now that you've removed me from the prep channels?" I asked. His smile faltered. Jonas looked down. For a moment, Victor blinked like he'd lost his line in the script. "Legal," he said finally. "They'll handle it." "No," I replied, "they won't." I didn't elaborate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer explanations. I simply let the silence stretch until he shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened. He didn't like not being the smartest person in the room. He ended the call quickly after that, saying he'd circle back with strategy notes. Predictably, he didn't, but what he did do was more revealing. He took my section of the Series C pitch deck, my system overview, my risk structure, the backbone of the entire operational narrative, and replaced nearly all of it. I didn't know until the next afternoon when I checked the shared drive. The 15 slides I'd built were now five empty, decorative, meaningless slides with no substance. 2 had stock photos, 1 was a mountain peak, 1 had a glowing arrow pointing up, the last was a tagline that made my stomach turn. "Infrastructure that inspires confidence." There was no detail, no context, no risk disclosures, no stability metrics. He'd gutted everything investors actually needed to trust the company. And at the very bottom of the file history, edited by Victor Lang. Of course, it wasn't incompetence, it was territory marking. He wasn't satisfied with shaping the narrative. He wanted credit for everything the narrative contained, even the things he didn't understand, especially those. I sat there for a long moment, absorbing the shift. This wasn't accidental erasure anymore. This was escalation. This was intentional. This was his attempt to push me out of the narrative entirely. But what Victor didn't know, what Jonas hadn't remembered, what even legal had overlooked, was that the system's architecture, the licensing layers, and the compliance structures he was so eager to water down still operated under a clause he hadn't read, a clause he didn't even know existed. And while he was busy polishing slides, I was busy preparing something else. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing the moment he would hand me the opportunity himself. And Victor Lang was the kind of man who always did. The morning of the investor demo felt strangely calm, the kind of stillness you only notice when something underneath is beginning to crack. I logged in early, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to make sure the backup route I'd built weeks earlier was still functioning. It was. My version of the pitch deck, the real one, the one with actual substance, sat quietly in the hidden instance I controlled. Victor didn't know it existed. Jonas didn't remember it existed. Legal had forgotten it existed, but the system hadn't. And systems don't lie. By the time the call officially began, the virtual room filled with glossy smiles and suits that tried too hard. The lead investor, Marissa Chen, appeared with the calm authority of a woman who'd seen every trick in the funding playbook and had stopped being impressed a decade ago. She sipped from a white mug, expression unreadable. Jonas opened with his usual vague optimism, tossing out buzzwords like lifelines, trajectory, acceleration, efficiency uplift, none of which meant anything in the real world. I stayed muted, camera off, watching. I wasn't scheduled to speak until slide 11, the segment Victor had butchered and reduced to 5 holographics. He wanted me barely visible. A technical footnote, a cameo. He had no idea he'd built the perfect stage for his own failure. When it was time for his part of the presentation, Victor took over with the confidence of a man performing for applause he believed he deserved. He talked about vision, market position, organizational synergy. His voice was smooth, animated, rehearsed, but the cracks showed when Marissa asked follow-up questions, specific ones he didn't anticipate. He stumbled twice, redirected 3 times, and each time her eyes sharpened just a little, like she was adjusting a microscope. Then Jonas cleared his throat and gave the handoff. And now Rachel will give a brief overview of our system compliance and licensing. Structure, brief. His word, not mine. Victor leaned back in his chair, already preparing to reclaim the spotlight. The slide transitioned, but not to his version. To mine. The backup deck loaded seamlessly, triggered by the routing logic they never bothered to understand. My 15-minute segment began playing automatically, with my voiceover synced to the animated risk flow map. For the first time on the call, the investors leaned forward. The system dashboard updated in real time, clean and stable. The IP sandboxing diagram unfolded with clarity. The liability chain visual lit up precisely the way I designed it. And then, for 2 minutes, I explained exactly how the architecture not only supported their growth projections, but protected them from legal exposure Victor hadn't even considered. I didn't embellish. I didn't brag. I communicated, clearly, calmly, factually, and that's what scared him. "Rachel, stop." His voice cut through the call like a blade made of panic and ego. I kept speaking, letting the animation finish. "Rachel, I said stop." His tone sharpened, desperate. I paused. My cursor hovered, but I said nothing. Then he delivered the blow he thought would end me. "You're done here. You're fired. Leave the presentation immediately." Silence. The kind of silence that makes the air feel heavier. Jonas blinked, frozen. Marisa lowered her mug and stared at him like he'd just tried to explain physics using crayons. And I? I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I reached forward, closed my laptop with a soft click, and stood up. No dramatic exit. No final words. Just a simple, quiet end to the moment he believed he'd won. I walked to the window of my loft, looking out at the slow movement of the river below, and pulled out my phone. 1 text, 3 words. Trigger clause 8.2b. No emoji, no explanation. My lawyer would understand exactly what that meant. And back in that virtual conference room, without me, they were about to learn what it meant too. The moment I closed my laptop, I knew the real story wasn't happening in that meeting anymore. It was happening in the spaces they'd never bothered to look. The contracts, the access logs, the back-end triggers tied to my credentials. I didn't need to witness the chaos to know how fast it would spread. I boiled water for tea, letting the quiet of my loft settle around me, while the company scrambled inside a storm entirely of their own making. My phone buzzed first. A short message from my lawyer. Received. Executing 8.2b now. That was enough. I turned notifications off. By 10:43 a.m., the first ripple hit. The investment firm's legal counsel sent an email to the company's internal legal team. Confirm Rachel Ward's role, current access status, and termination record by 5 p.m. EST or Series C review will be suspended. No greeting, no signature, no cushion. It was the legal equivalent of a loaded gun placed gently, on the table. I wasn't on that call, but I can imagine the room. Jonas's face draining of color, Victor pretending to understand what the email even meant. The CTO flipping through the term sheet printout like he was searching for a spell that could reverse time. Meanwhile, engineers, real engineers, were discovering the truth I never needed to say out loud. Someone posted a screenshot of a commit log showing my author stamps on half the critical modules in the deployment ladder. Someone else found a compliance flowchart labeled Exposure Proxy Layer, with my initials next to the sign-off. Another unearthed the encrypted license tree, every certificate routed to a key generated under my temporary contract credentials. Slack went from confused to frantic in under an hour. Then Victor attempted damage control. He sent out a company-wide announcement dripping with false confidence. Just to clarify, Rachel contributed to our early system planning, but all her work has been absorbed and is fully manageable by internal teams. He should have stopped there, but arrogance always asks for one more line. An engineer replied publicly, "This is incorrect. Half the current deployment plan links to her environment. Also, we still don't have access to the compliance handoff she authored. No anger, no snark, just facts delivered like a blade laid flat on the table, point forward. The thread exploded. Developers asking questions leadership couldn't answer. Legal pinging the channel at odd intervals. Operations quietly panicking because partners had already asked for updated license documentation they couldn't provide without me. They tried reactivating my old account, resetting my password, restoring my permissions. None of it worked. They didn't understand the system because none of them cared enough to learn it when they had the chance. I'd built an authentication ladder that required biometric reset protocols validated through a third-party vault. And once Clause 8.2b activated, privilege thresholds rerouted automatically. They weren't locked out because I was petty. They were locked out because I designed the system to protect itself from uninformed hands. By late afternoon, the CEO called an emergency leadership sync. Jonas sounded like a man chewing on glass. Legal stammered through half-formed ideas about reinstatement procedures. Victor arrived late, smugness still clinging to him like cheap cologne. He didn't understand what he'd triggered. He thought firing me would erase me. Instead, it made me unavoidable. And for the first time since rejoining the company, I didn't feel frustrated or tired. I felt in control. They hadn't just fired the architect. They'd severed the only lifeline keeping their entire system, their funding, and their future from collapsing. And the collapse had already begun. By early evening, the panic had shifted from confusion to something heavier, something closer to dread. I could feel it even from my loft, miles away from their conference rooms and empty reassurances. They weren't dealing with a technical issue anymore. They were dealing with a legal one, a contractual landmine they'd stepped on with both feet. My lawyer forwarded a message the board had sent internally, and even through the clinical language, I could hear the urgency. They'd finally pulled my original consulting agreement, the one they never expected would matter again, and someone had read it aloud on a board call that sounded like a sinking ship. Clause 4.7, reinstatement during operational restructuring. Clause 8.2b, fallback licensing authority for any infrastructure I personally authored. They hadn't just fired me during an active funding cycle, they had severed contractually protected oversight tied directly to their Series C eligibility. It wasn't symbolic, it was structural. On the next call, which I wasn't on but received a transcript of later, the board pressed Jonas first. Who approved terminating Rachel's access during compliance review? Silence. Then someone asked the question that finally broke the illusion they had under control. Who owns the infrastructure licensing keys now? Another silence. You could almost hear the air thinning. Then came the part that made even me raise an eyebrow. Maurice's team had run a standard background refresh on Victor, the kind investors do quietly when something feels off. They found a buried report from his previous company involving misreported churn metrics swept under the rug during an acquisition. Nothing criminal, but deeply unethical. The board demanded to know why this wasn't flagged before hiring him. Jonas had vouched for him personally. Old network ties, alumni connections, blind trust disguised as leadership. Meanwhile, legal confirmed that 3 vendor agreements were already in breach because they lacked my signature authority. 2 more would lapse within 72 hours. The CTO, a usually quiet man who kept his head down, finally spoke. We can't deploy anything without her. Half the system runs through licensing she created. We can't even modify code in those modules legally. Victor tried to jump in, talking over him with the frantic confidence of someone who still thought he could outbluff facts. She's not indispensable. We can recreate whatever she built. The general counsel shut him down flat. No, we cannot. Not in the time frame, and not without violating her intellectual property rights. It'll trigger penalties we cannot afford. For the first time, Victor went silent. Real silent, not defensive silent, the kind where someone realizes the story isn't going the way they rehearsed in their head. The board called for an emergency vote, not on me, on him, and on Jonas. Leadership restructuring, effective immediately. I imagined Jonas sitting there watching the title he protected so fiercely slip through his fingers. I imagined Victor, realizing that the narrative he tried to control had turned on him, dragging him out by the collar. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt something steadier, validation. They hadn't believed I held power because I never raised my voice. But power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, patient and quiet, until the moment someone hands it exactly what it needs. And Victor handed me everything. Marisa didn't waste time with pleasantries when she called me the next morning. Her assistant sent a direct line request at 6:30 a.m., the kind of hour only two types of people reach out: those in crisis and those ready to make decisions. When I answered, her tone was calm but knife-sharp, the voice of someone who had already read every document attached to my name. "Rachel," she said, "I understand why you left." I didn't apologize. I didn't soften. "Then you understand what needs to happen next." A pause, not hesitation, but acknowledgement. "Tell me your terms." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an invitation to define the new balance of power. I spoke plainly. No titles. No return as an employee. No more being tucked into the corner of someone else's deck. I wanted every piece of infrastructure I built transferred under a licensing agreement with my own LLC, Rivenset Labs. They could use it, scale it, profit from it, but only with my authorization, my oversight, and my signature. She agreed before I finished the sentence. So I kept going. Retroactive compensation at double my original consulting rate. Not a bonus, not a goodwill gesture. Payment for the months they built their entire pitch on my architecture while sidelining me from the very room that needed my voice. Again, she agreed. I could hear her pen moving. Then came the part that would sting the most. "Victor is out," I said, "today." Her response was immediate. "He resigned at 5 a.m., the board accepted." I didn't bother pretending to be surprised. Men like him crumble fast when their performance mirror cracks. "And Jonas," I continued, "he doesn't stay." A breath. "The board voted at midnight. Interim leadership takes over this week." The speed was impressive but predictable. Investors don't care about ego. They care about stability, accountability, and the protection of their money. And firing me mid-presentation triggered every alarm in that world. Finally, I set the last boundary. Any system, update, or product touching my architecture moves forward only with my written approval. No exceptions. No overrides. "Understood," she said. There was no power struggle, no counter-argument, just acceptance. Because she knew what the company finally understood. Their future depended on what I built, and I was done being the ghost in the machine they pretended wasn't there. When we ended the call, there were no congratulations, no empty corporate assurances, just the quiet confirmation that the balance had shifted exactly where it needed to be. I didn't want revenge. I wanted ownership, autonomy, and the right to define the terms of my own value. And now, finally, all of it was mine. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't need to. The company that once treated me like a temporary fix now operated under agreements that required my signature before they could so much as push a minor update. Rivenset Labs, my quiet little LLC, became the gateway to every system they relied on. Not out of spite, but structure, out of clarity, out of finally taking up the space they tried to shrink me out of. The press release landed a week later, sterile language about leadership realignment and strategic oversight enhancements. No mention of Victor, no quote from Jonas, not a single word about why the changes were necessary. That was fine. The truth didn't need a headline. It lived in the term sheet addendum that investors signed with unshakable confidence, the one listing every core infrastructure element under non-transferable license to Rivenset Labs. My name didn't need to appear publicly. It didn't have to. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the paperwork, in the signatures, in the dependencies no one else can untangle. One evening, sitting in a small cafe near the river, my laptop hummed beside a half-finished cup of tea. The final Series C report arrived in my inbox, approved, oversubscribed, secured. At the bottom, in clean legal wording, final technical authority retained by Rachel Ward, external systems architect. My phone buzzed once with a single message from an unsaved but familiar number. "You're in charge now. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I closed the laptop, breathed in the quiet, and let the world settle exactly where it belonged. I didn't walk away from that company feeling triumphant. I walked away understanding something I should have learned years earlier. Overgiving is a slow kind of self-erasure. For too long, I believed that if I worked harder, stayed quiet, filled every gap, and held everything together, people would value me the way I valued the work. But the truth is simpler and harsher. Some workplaces will take everything you offer and still ask why you aren't giving more. My story isn't about revenge, not really. It's about boundaries, the boundaries motive. It's about realizing that every time I stayed late, every time I fixed what someone else broke, every time I let a comment slide or stayed silent to keep the peace, I was teaching them how to treat me. And eventually I had nothing left but resentment and a reputation for being the one who always fixes it. That's a dangerous label, because once people count on you to hold the world together, they stop noticing you're holding it alone. What changed everything wasn't rage or revenge. It was stepping back far enough to see what I'd allowed. And when I walked out, it wasn't to prove anything to anyone. It was to protect what was left of myself. The irony is that the moment I finally set boundaries, people who never listened suddenly scrambled to hear my voice. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. In your own life, notice where you're giving more than you're receiving. Pay attention to the excuses you make for other people's behavior. Ask yourself whether you're staying because it's familiar or because it's healthy. How to get started today. Say no to one thing that drains you. Set a small boundary, even a quiet one. Step back from a situation where you feel invisible and observe it clearly. Write down what you want, not what others expect. If this story resonated, comment your takeaway, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.